about how Holden killed GM. So if I get anything wrong, please let me in the comments, and I will hopefully have the power to remake whatever section of the video that I screwed up. But I did an extensive research, that's why it took so long. I put out the poll a while ago, and I'm trying to, make it, I'm not trying to, disrespect Holden by making it a quick, fast video, but I don't want to, do what I usually do, repeat myself, linger, all that crap, So, Holden was a car company founded in 1856. The city of Adelaide in Australia, remember, Holden's an Australian car company, was founded in 1836. Holden as a car company was founded 20 years after Adelaide was as a city. And if you don't know, Adelaide's a beautiful city in Australia, and it's the birthplace of Holden. Holden started here. Just a very nice car. They made a lot of very interesting vehicles. In fact, Holden existed before GM did. General Motors was officially formed in 1908. Holden was formed in 1856. Way before GM ever did, right? And then in 1931, terrible photo. It's very difficult to find old Holden models. Anyway, GM officially bought Holden in 1931. GM was looking to expand into different areas, right? GM had just barely captivated the US market, right? And they were looking to go into similar countries like the UK and Australia, right? Just so that, it was easy place, they could flip the vehicles easily to sell in those markets. That's what GM was looking for. Ute. And, Australia seemed perfect. They had a small population, and GM could test a lot of the vehicles over there to see what they, see how things were going. Now, you may think that this is where Holden went down. It went terrible from here, As an American who's familiar with GM, almost maybe 5 years after GM touches something, it turns to shit. So did that happen here? No, they actually had an amazing time. In fact, the Holden Commodore, one of Holden's best-selling vehicles, was formed under GM's leadership, because this was one of the best cars, arguably one of the best cars that GM had ever created, and GM and Holden had an amazing relationship. It wasn't GM was strangling Holden, being one of those, the bad owner, right? It was more of like a Ford and Volvo situation, where Volvo could operate independently from Ford, but they could work together on different things, GM respected Holden. Holden respected GM. They weren't just another division, like Buick or Cadillac. It was kind of like its own separate car company altogether, and the two car companies worked together and respected each other, and everything went great. In fact, the Holden Commodore was made for a very, very, very long time, and in 2002, the sales peaked. GM and Holden were working together. They were making sporty, great, reliable vehicles that people love to own, right? People love to own them. People love to buy them. You could have cheap Holdens, expensive Holdens, nice Holdens, great Holdens. You had sedans like the Vectra. You had things like this. So this was going great, right? I mean, everything's got to be going up from here. Oh, no. I just made a video on Daewoo, right? I did, on GM's cars. It's like a breakup, right? GM was interested in other people, right? Holden was no longer fascinating to GM, right? GM knows Holden. GM knows what sells in Australia. GM's bored, right? GM wants the big areas. They want India, right? They want Korea. They want China. They want the big areas, right? With lots of people. Australia, they don't need to test their cars out anymore, in a smaller country. They don't need that echo chamber anymore. They can recreate that in the US. They don't need Holden. So they decided to buy Daewoo. Daewoo was a small Korean manufacturer, and this car company, Daewoo, would be the start for GM. This was a smaller car company that made small, reliable cars. Perfect for GM. They would take all the Daewoo models, rebadge them as Chevrolets, and put them in India. Every single car country across the world that wasn't familiar with GM models, they would use Daewoo's, reputation to market them as Chevrolets, and then just kind of butt into those markets, right? And that was the plan, right? GM was excited about this. But when doing that, they just didn't care about Holden anymore. They didn't get anything out of Holden. They did, but naive. They didn't feel like they got anything out of Holden anymore. So they just started to not care. The sales may have continued to go up as of 2002, But it wasn't there. You could tell GM wasn't behind Holden anymore. GM was off with Daewoo, going across the world, India, China, plotting this, plotting the Cadillac takeover, plotting all these stupid ideas. And Holden got caught by the wayside. Holden, it wasn't a mutual relationship anymore. It was GM giving Holden a, binky and saying, shut up, go to hell. And that's essentially what the relationship turned to. It got sour very quickly. GM, like I said, Holden wasn't interesting. They just didn't care. Holden wasn't the future to them. The future was cheap plastic garbage. Just cheap, unreliable plastic garbage. And there was no way Holden could really get out. Now, Holden's had a lot of car models over the years. A lot of great ones, too. Just ultimately amazing cars. But then sales started to fall in the 2010s. So why did exactly Holden sales start to fall in the 2010s? Because of cars like this. Well, not like this. Because of, I have an entire list of them, but let me just find, essentially, because GM wasn't interested in Holden anymore, right? GM wasn't, like this. Whew. GM wasn't interested in Holden anymore. GM started to get sloppy. Now, when Toyota gets sloppy, right? Toyota started to get sloppy with Lexus. They caught back up and they made Lexus the best again. Usually that's what happens when a car company gets sloppy. GM got sloppy and they started making the things like the Commodore, right? They started making more versions of the Commodore, trying to cash in as many chips as they possibly could. And slowly over time, their cars started to get less and less reliable, and less people started to trust them. Meanwhile, GM, there's a lot you can say about GM. But the interesting thing you can say about them is that they care about sedans. Around this time, all that GM cared about was platforms and sedans. They could do both of those exceptionally well compared to every other thing that they touched. So that's really all Holden had, was just a lot of sedans. Just so many sedans. And they were all competing in the same market. Holden didn't get a lot of cars. And the cars that they did get were just cheap rebrands. I mean, look at the badge on the Holden Suburban. That doesn't scream quality. And also, Holden buyers were smart enough to see through this facade that GM was putting up. The sales started to decrease in 2010. And, unlike a normal car company, right? When a normal car company, let's pretend like you're leaning back in your chair, right? Like I am right now. And all of a sudden you lose your balance and you're starting to go back. You usually pull yourself back up just in time. GM pushed against whatever they were holding on to so far so that they could hit the ground. They didn't hit the ground. They fell through it. That's exactly what they did. So what did Holden do during this time? Of course, they put more money into Daewoo. The Daewoo project was an immaculate failure. The only decent things that they got out of that project, they didn't get world domination. In fact, they ended up pulling out of those markets several years later. The only decent things they got out of them was the Spark and the Sonic, two mediocre at best hatchbacks. That's all they got out of these projects. They could have so much out of Holden. But GM was done. They had convinced themselves that Holden was nothing. Holden wasn't important anymore. They didn't care about Holden. So they leaned into it. Right? That's what they did. Cars got less and less reliable. We got the Holden Cruise. Yay! Wow, totally not a Chevrolet at all. GM got so lazy with Holden. They refused to make a single new car that wasn't a rebadge. Yay! Thank God I have my Holden Cruise. Such a great, amazing, reliable car. Let me hop in my Holden Equinox, totally a separate, its own unique car. Not even Buick. Buick and Cadillac, two luxury car companies, got their own version of the Equinox. It wasn't a rebadge. It was their own separate model, right? They could redesign it. It was redesigned. Holden, a car company that was older than GM and could possibly bring in more money than GM, they didn't care about it anymore. In fact, Holden's sale, it's very interesting. Holden sales in 2013 are now like GM sales now. This just proves that this strategy doesn't get you anything. These cheap-ass, lazy rebrands is what ended up killing Holden. Holden was screaming for help, And they got this, the Holden tracks. They just got bullshit. That's what they got. GM didn't care. GM was trying to ream them out as fast as possible. They got the Holden Spark. You know? That's how GM killed Holden. I can say that with full confidence. These cheap, piece of shit, awful, unreliable, garbage cars that not even Holden people wanted. And we can see 2013, 112,000 down. Just started falling. Just absolutely plummeting. Took the death toll, right? General Motors scraps Holden division. That's right. This just shows how much of a dirty, sleazy, dirtbag, fleabag company they are. They didn't discontinue Holden. They scrapped it. How much more disrespectful can you get? A car company that is older than GM, that can possibly bring in more sales than GM, they don't discontinue, they scrap it. And technically those two things are the same thing, but at the same time, it's worded differently. They chose to say scrap, right? They chose to say scrap, not discontinue, scrap. They scrapped the whole project. They didn't even try to sell Holden. They didn't even try. They just scrapped it. And if it was a bittersweet note, like they had great cars up until the end. No. You could buy used Holdens, but they were all just the Holden Cruise, just these tiny little unreliable, awful models, and that's just what Holden was known for. Like this! The Holden Malibu! Great! I've never seen any of these before. That's how Holden died. If you're wondering, Holden died because GM is a sleazebag, a dirtbag, a fleabag. That's what GM is. That's what GM will always be. And these other interests, like I said before, the pie in the sky that they ditched Holden, Ford, Daewoo, and all these other brands, none of them ended up being successful either. So it's like if they were they found billions of gold bricks on Saturn or something, and they were trying to figure out a space cruiser to get over there to mine the gold bricks. That's a whole different story. Still a bad thing, but a whole different story. But discontinuing Holden, killing a gigantically long history just for some cheap ass fake deal. And to try and get your way in foreign markets that also don't want you there, that you eventually end up pulling out of. Yeah. That's what happened. That's how GM killed Holden. They didn't care. They didn't care. Real low note. Anyways, thanks for watching. Don't forget to comment, like, and subscribe. And don't buy GM. They're not good vehicles. They're not. No matter what you say.